Livy Book 37, 190 BC. When Lucius Cornelius Scipio and Gaius Laelius entered the consulship, the very first piece of business arising in the Senate after the religious observances was the Aetolian question. The Aetolian delegates were pressing for action because the day marking the end of the truce was near, and they were also supported by Titus Quintius, who had now returned to Rome from Greece. The Aetolians placed more hope in the compassion of the Senate than they did in the strength of their case, and they adopted a suppliant attitude, trying to mitigate their recent offenses by pointing to their former services. But while they were in the house, they were from every direction plied with questions by the senators, who were trying to squeeze from them an admission of guilt rather than genuine answers. And when they were ordered to withdraw from the Senate House, they became the subject of a vigorous debate. Anger played a greater part in their case than did compassion, for the fury of the senators was directed at them not merely as enemies, but as a wild tribe of people incapable of making an alliance. When the discussion had gone on for a number of days, it was finally decided that the Aetolians should be neither granted nor refused a peace treaty. They were offered two options: either to put themselves entirely in the hands of the Senate, or else pay 1,000 talents, and accept the same friends and enemies as the Romans. The Aetolians wanted clarification of the areas in which they would be in the Senate's hands, but they were given no straightforward response. As a result, they were sent off without a peace settlement, under orders to leave the city that very day, and Italy within 15 days. After this discussion of the consular provinces began. Both consuls wanted Greece. Laelius had great influence in the Senate, and when that body instructed the consuls either to draw lots or come to an agreement between themselves on the provinces, he said the consuls would show great discretion if they left the matter to the judgment of the senators rather than to the lot. Scipio's reply was that he would give some thought to the course he should take. He then discussed the question with his brother, and him alone. When he was told by his brother that he would confidently leave the matter to the Senate, Scipio then reported to his colleague that he would accept his proposal. This was a novel procedure, or else one based on precedents long forgotten, and it piqued the interest of the senators who were expecting a contest. Then Publius Scipio Africanus declared that if the senators formally assigned the province of Greece to his brother, Lucius Scipio, he would accompany him as his legate. This statement was received with great approval and brought the contest to an end. The Senate wished to put to the test which of the two had the more reliable support: Antiochus in the defeated Hannibal, or the consul and the Roman legions in the victorious Africanus. The decision to assign Greece to Scipio and Italy to Laelius was practically unanimous. 2. The Praetorian sortition, which took place next, went as follows: Lucius Aurunculeius, urban jurisdiction; Gnaeus Fulvius, foreign jurisdiction; Lucius Aemilius Regillus, the fleet; Publius Junius Brutus, Etruria; Marcus Tucius, Apulia and Bruttium; Gaius Antinius, Sicily. The consul who had been assigned Greece as his province was then allocated a supplementary force, in addition to the army of 2 legions which he was to assume from Manius Acilius, and this comprised 3,000 infantry and 100 cavalry of Roman citizens, plus 5,000 infantry and 200 cavalry from the allies and the Latin League. It was further decided that the consul should take his army across to Asia when he reached his province, if that seemed to be in the interest of the state. The other consul was assigned a completely fresh army composed of 2 Roman legions and 15,000 infantry and 600 cavalry from the allies and the Latin League. Since Quintus Minucius had written to say that his provincial responsibility had now been fulfilled, and that the entire Ligurian nation had capitulated, he was instructed to take his army from Liguria to the land of the Boii and turn it over to the proconsul Publius Cornelius. Cornelius was at the time conducting the Boii from the lands which he had confiscated from them after their defeat in the war. To govern Apulia and Bruttium, the praetor Marcus Atucius was given the 2 urban legions which had been raised the previous year, as well as 15,000 infantry and 600 cavalry of the allies and the Latin League. Aulus Cornelius, who had been praetor the previous year and had held Bruttium with an army, was ordered to take his legions over to Aetolia, if such was the consul's pleasure, and transfer them to Manius Acilius, if the latter wished to remain there. If Acilius preferred to return to Rome, then Aulus Cornelius was under orders to remain in Aetolia with the army. It was also decided that Gaius Antonius Labeo should take over from Marcus Aemilius the province of Sicily and its army, and, if he wished, raised from the province itself a supplementary force of 2,000 infantry and 100 cavalry. Publius Iunius Brutus was instructed to raise a fresh army for service against the Etruscans, 1 Roman legion and 10,000 infantry and 400 cavalry of the allies and the Latin League. Lucius Aemilius, holder of the maritime jurisdiction, was directed to take over from the previous year's praetor, Marcus Iunius, 20 warships with their crews, and to enlist 1,000 sailors and 2,000 infantry himself. With these ships and fighting men, he was to set off for Asia and assume command of the fleet from Gaius Livius. The governors of the 2 Spains and Sardinia saw their commands extended for a year, and the same armies assigned to them. 2 tithes of grain were requisitioned from both Sicily and Sardinia that year. The orders were issued for all the Sicilian grain to be taken to the army in Aetolia, while that from Sardinia was to go partly to Rome, and partly, like the Sicilian, to Aetolia. 3. It was decided that the prodigies should be expiated by the pontiffs before the consuls left for their provinces. At Rome, the temple of Juno Lucina had been struck by lightning so violently that its roof and doors were warped, and in Puteoli several parts of the city wall as well as the gate were lightning struck, with 2 men losing their lives. At Nursia, it was well documented that there had been a sudden downpour on a clear day, and that 2 freemen were killed there as well. The people of Tusculum reported that showers of earth had fallen in their lands, and those of Riat that a mule had given birth in theirs. These prodigies were expiated, and the Latin festival was repeated because the people of Laurentum had not been given the meat due to them. Because of these divine manifestations, public prayer was also offered to deities specified by the decemvirs after they consulted the books. 10 free-born boys and 10 girls, all with living fathers and mothers, were employed for the sacrifice, and the decemvirs offered up unweaned animals by night. Before he left, Publius Cornelius Scipio Africanus set up an arch on the Capitol facing the road that leads up to the Capitol, and with 7 gilded fingers and 2 equestrian statues, and before the arch he placed 2 marble basins. At this time, 43 leading Aetolians, including Democritus and his brother, were brought to Rome by 2 cohorts which had been sent out by Manius Acilius, and were thrown into Lautumiae, spelled Lautumiae. Lautumiae. The consul, Lucius Cornelius, then ordered the cohorts to return to the army. There also arrived from Ptolemy and Cleopatra, king and queen of Egypt, ambassadors offering congratulations on the consul Manius Acilius's expulsion of Antiochus from Greece, and urging the senators to send an army across to Asia. Panic had spread, not just throughout Asia, but throughout Syria as well, they said, and the rulers of Egypt would be ready to comply with any decision of the Senate. The king and queen were formally thanked, and instructions were issued for the ambassadors to be presented with 4,000 asses each. 4. After completing all that needed doing in Rome, the consul Lucius Cornelius held an assembly at which he issued instructions for all his men to muster at Brundisium on the 15th of July, both the supplementary troops which he had himself enrolled, and those who were in Brutium with the propraetor Iulus Cornelius. He also appointed 3 officers, Sextus, Digitius, Lucius Apostius, and Gaius Fabricius Lucinus, to bring together at Brundisium ships from all points along the coast. All his preparations concluded, Cornelius then set out from the city in his military cloak. As the consul was leaving, about 5,000 volunteers, Romans and allies, who had served their time under the command of Publius Africanus, presented themselves to him and enlisted for service with him. The consul set out for the campaign on the 11th of July during the games of Apollo, and at that time the light faded during the daytime when the sky was clear, as the moon passed under the sun's orb. Lucius Aemilius Regillus, to whom the fleet had fallen as his area of responsibility, also set out at the same time as the consul. Lucius Aurunculeius was assigned the task of constructing 30 quinqueremes and 20 triremes by the Senate, because it was reported that following the naval battle, Antiochus was rebuilding his fleet on a considerably larger scale. When their ambassadors returned from Rome with the news that there was no hope of peace, the Aetolians seized Mount Corax to block the Romans' approach. All their coastline facing the Peloponnese had been laid waste by the Achaeans, but the Aetolians were thinking of their present danger rather than past losses, for they were in no doubt that the Romans would return at the start of spring to attack Naupactus, spelled Naupactus. Acilius knew that this was what the Aetolians expected, and it seemed to him a better idea to try a surprise maneuver and attack Lamia. Its people, he reasoned, had been brought to the verge of destruction by Philip, and besides, they could on that occasion be caught off guard simply because they had no fear of such a move. Setting off from Elatia, Achilles first pitched camp in enemy territory close to the river Spercheius. From there, he advanced at night, and at dawn attacked the city walls with a military cordon. Spercheius, spelled Spercheius, Cheus. 5. There followed the great alarm and uproar that usually attends an unexpected event. Even so, the inhabitants that day defended their city with greater resolve than one might have expected them to do in the face of sudden danger. The men were doing the fighting, and the women were carrying to the walls all manner of weapons and rocks, too, even though scaling ladders had already been set up at many points. Acilius sounded the retreat, and led his troops back to camp at about midday. When the men were revived by food and rest, and before he dismissed his council of war, he made an announcement. They were to be in arms and ready to move before dawn, and he would not bring them back to camp without the city being taken. He then made his attack at several points at the same hour as he had done the previous day, and since the townspeople lacked strength, weapons, and more than anything else the will to resist, he took the city in a few hours. Acilius, or Achilles, sold some of the spoils, and distributed some amongst the troops, after which he held a council to consider his next move. No one wanted to go to Naupactus, since the pass to Corax was held by the Aetolians. Acilius instead decided to attack Amphissa. He did not want the campaigning season frittered away, or for the Aetolians to enjoy, through his hesitation, a peace which they had failed to obtain from the Senate. The army was taken down from Heraclea over Auta, and when he had established his camp before the walls of Amphissa, Acilius used siege works, not a military cordon, as at Lamia, for his assault on the city. Battering rams were brought up in several places at the same time, and as the walls were being pounded, the townspeople made no attempt to prepare or devise any countermeasures for this kind of apparatus. All their hopes lay in their fighting ability and courage, and with persistent counterattacks they harried the advanced posts of the enemy, and even those manning the earthworks and siege engines. Six. The wall had, even so, been shattered at several points, when Acilius was brought word that his successor had set his army ashore at Apollonia, and was now proceeding through Epirus and Thessaly. In fact, the consul was coming with 3,000 infantry and 500 cavalry, and had already reached the Malian Gulf. From here he sent men ahead to Hypata to order the inhabitants to surrender the city. The reply came back that the people of Hypata would act only on a communal decision by the Aetolians, not to be held back by a siege of Hypata when Amphissa was still not captured. Scipio first sent ahead his brother Africanus, and then marched on Amphissa. At their approach, the townspeople abandoned the city, which by now had been largely divested of its walls, and everybody, armed men and non-combatants alike, retreated to the citadel, which they considered impregnable. The consul encamped about 6 miles away. Ambassadors from Athens came to the camp to plead on behalf of the Aetolians, addressing themselves first to Publius Scipio, who, as was noted above, had gone ahead of the column, and, after him, to the consul. They received a more sympathetic response from Africanus. The latter was looking for a pretext to quit the Aetolian war with honor, and had his attention focused on Asia and King Antiochus. Africanus had therefore told the Athenians to convince the Aetolians as well as the Romans to accept peace as a better option than war. At the prompting of the Athenians, a large delegation of Aetolians came swiftly from Hypatia. They approached Africanus first, and his words also increased their hopes of obtaining peace, for he enumerated the many nations and peoples who had put themselves in his hands, in Spain first of all, and then in Africa. The spelling of Hypata or Hypatia, it's probably pronounced Hypata, as it's spelled Hypata. End of footnote. In every case, he said he had left them with better reasons for remembering his clemency and generosity than his valor in battle. The problem appeared to be resolved, but when the consul was approached, he made the same response with which the Aetolians had been rebuffed by the Senate. When they reached this fresh blow, the Aetolians could see that the Athenian embassy and Africanus's indulgent response to them had meant nothing, and they declared that they wished to report back to their own people. 7. The delegates returned from there to Hypata, but no plan of action presented itself. There was no way of raising the 1,000 talent payment, and the Aetolians were afraid that if they put themselves entirely in the Senate's hands, they might be subjected to physical injury. They therefore ordered the same envoys to return to the consul and to Africanus, and to ask them either to reduce the total of the money to be paid, or else direct that complete surrender not entail physical maltreatment of citizens. That is, if they really did want to grant the Aetolians peace, and not merely give them a glimpse of it, thereby frustrating the hopes of hapless men. They failed to make the consul effect any change, and that embassy was also dismissed with nothing achieved. The Athenians followed the envoys home. The Aetolians were sickened now by all the rejections, and were bemoaning the fortunes of their people with futile laments. But Academus, head of the Athenian delegation, revived their hopes with the suggestion that they ask for 6 months' truce to enable them to send representatives to Rome. The delay, he said, would not increase their current ills, which were as bad as they could be, and their present tribulations might possibly be relieved by any number of fortuitous events that could occur in the intervening period. On Academus's recommendation, the same delegates were sent once more. They met Publius Scipio first, and thanks to his intercession, managed to gain from the consul a truce for the requisite period. The siege of Amphissa was raised, and Manius Acilius quit the province after transferring command of the army to the consul. The latter headed back to Thessaly from Amphissa in order to march into Asia by way of Macedonia and Thrace. Africanus then spoke as follows to his brother: "The road in which you are setting out has my approval. 2. Lucius Scipio, but all depends on Philip's inclinations. If he loyally supports our authority, he will provide us with a safe passage, provisions, and all the things that sustain and assist an army on a long march. If he deserts us, you will have no security passing through Thrace. So my feeling is that we should first test the king's disposition, and that will be best tested if the man sent catches him by surprise, when his reaction is in no way premeditated." Selected for this task was Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus, by far the most dynamic young man of his time. By using horses stationed in relays, Gracchus achieved almost unbelievable speed, reaching Pella from Amphissa, his point of dispatch, in 2 days. The king was at dinner, and had drunk a lot of wine, and of itself this relaxed state of mind allayed all suspicion that he intended any mischief. At the time, moreover, the guest was given a warm welcome, and the next day he saw provisions that had been liberally stockpiled for the army, bridges built over rivers, and roads constructed where passage was difficult. Taking back this news as swiftly as he had come, Gracchus met the consul at Thumacae. From here, buoyed by more positive and sanguine hopes, the army came to Macedonia to find everything prepared for them. On their arrival, the king welcomed and entertained the Scipios with regal liberality. He seemed possessed of great consideration and civility, qualities that won the approval of Africanus, who, an outstanding man in all other respects, was not averse to a cordiality that shunned extravagance. From there the Romans reached the Hellespont, passing through Thrace as well as Macedonia, escorted by Philip, who made the preparations for every step of the journey. 8. After the naval battle at Corycus, Antiochus had spent all his free time in the winter on preparations on land and sea, and not to be completely stripped of his hold on the sea, had paid particular attention to refurbishing his fleet. It did occur to him that he had been defeated at a time when the Rhodian fleet had not been present, and that if this armament should also take part in fighting, and the Rhodians would not make the mistake of lagging behind a second time, he would need a large number of ships to match the enemy fleet in strength and size. Accordingly, he had dispatched Hannibal to Syria to fetch Phoenician ships, and he also ordered Polyxenidas, spelt Polyxenidas, to refit his remaining vessels and to build others, and do it all the more energetically in view of his earlier lack of success. Antiochus himself spent the winter in Pergia, calling for assistance from every quarter. He had even sent to Gallograecia, whose people at the time were more pugnacious. They still possessed their Gallic spirit, since the original strain of the people had not yet died out. He had left his son Seleucus with an army in Aeolus to keep the coastal cities under control. These were being incited to rebellion on one side by Eumenes from Pergamon, and on the other from Phocaea and Erythrae by the Romans. The Roman fleet was wintering at Cannae, as noted above, and about midwinter Eumenes arrived there with 20,000 infantry and 500 cavalry. He remarked that a large amount of plunder could be taken from enemy territory around Thyatira, spelled Thyatira, 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 and by his urging prevailed upon Livius to send 5,000 men with him. The men were sent removed a massive quantity. Tongue-tied. The men who were sent removed a massive quantity of booty in a matter of days. 9. Meanwhile, civil unrest rose in Phocaea, when some people tried to win the support of the masses for Antiochus. Winter quarters for the ships caused hardship for the Phoenicians. The tribute also caused hardship because 500 togas and 500 tunics were requisitioned from them, and even further hardship came from a shortage of grain, which prompted the fleet and Roman garrison to leave them. With this, the faction holding meetings to win the support of the commons for Antiochus was delivered from fear, and while the Senate and aristocrats advocated standing by the Roman alliance, the ringleaders of the disaffection had more influence with the masses. Compensating for their tardiness the previous summer, the Rhodians were quick to send out at the spring equinox. Pisistratus, the same admiral as before, with 36 ships. By now Livius had left Cannae with 30 ships of his own, and 7 quadriremes which Eumenes had brought with him. and was heading for the Hellespont to make the necessary preparations for the crossing of the army which he thought would be arriving by land. He first of all put in at the so-called port of Achaeans. From there, or or Achaeans, right? You're familiar with the word, but anyway, the spelling Achaeans, Achaeans. From there, he went up to Ilium, where he sacrificed to Minerva, and then gave a gracious hearing to deputations from neighboring communities from Elaeus, Dardanus, and Rhoetium, who put their towns under his protection. From there he sailed to the mouth of the Hellespont. He left 10 ships stationed off Abydos and crossed with the rest of the fleet into Europe to launch an attack on Sestus. His soldiers were already approaching the walls when some Galli, the frenzied priests, met them before the gate, dressed in robes of their cult. They declared that they were the servants of the goddess, the mother of the gods, and that it was at her behest that they came to entreat the Romans to spare their walls and their city. None of them was ill-treated, and soon the Senate and magistrates came forth to surrender the city. From there, the fleet crossed to Abydos. Here, after meetings to sound out the feelings of the people, produced no response to suggest a peaceful settlement. The Romans readied themselves for a blockade. 10. Such were events in the Hellespont. Meanwhile, the king's officer, Polyxenidas, who was in exile from Rhodes, had heard that a fleet of his countrymen had left home, and that its commander, Pisistratus, had made some disparaging and offensive comments against him at a public meeting. As a result, Polyxenidas' feelings towards him had become particularly hostile, and day and night all he thought about was ways of making Pisistratus eat his disdainful words. He sent to him a man who was also known as Pisistratus, to say that he, Polyxenidas, if he were allowed, could be very useful to him and to his native land. Polyxenidas could also be restored to his country through Pisistratus's agency. Surprised, Pisistratus asked how this could be done. Polyxenidas asked him to give his word that they would see the affair through together or keep it shrouded in silence, and Pisistratus agreed. Then the go-between explained that Polyxenidas would deliver up to him either the whole or the greater part of the king's fleet, and his asking price for this great service was merely his restoration to the native land. So momentous was the proposition that it would permit Pisistratus neither to believe nor to disregard Polyxenidas's words. He made for Panhormus, in Samian territory, and moored there to examine in detail the offer that had been made to him. Messengers came and went between the two, but Pisistratus could not be satisfied until Polyxenidas wrote out with his own hand, in the presence of Pisistratus's messenger, that he would make good his promise, and sent to him the tablets stamped with his seal. This pledge made Pisistratus think he really had bought the traitor, for he believed a man living under a monarch would not have ventured to provide evidence against himself in his own handwriting. After this, the scenario for fake betrayal was put together. Polyxenidas said he would drop all preparations and would not have a large number of oarsmen or other members of the crews attached to the fleet. He would beach some of his ships on the pretext of repairing them, and others he would send off to nearby harbors, but he would keep a few on the open sea before the ports of Ephesus, and bring those into battle of circumstances forced him to put to sea. When Pisistratus heard that Polysenides was to be remiss in handling his fleet, he immediately became remiss himself. He sent some of his ships to Halicarnassus to fetch supplies and others to the city of Samos. And following that, there's a sharp bracket indicating a blank on the text, I believe, where a word has been, blotted or it's not there. So as to be ready when he received from the traitor the signal to attack. Polysenides used some deception to delude him further. He beached a number of ships and built dockyards to create the impression that he would beach others. And instead of bringing his oarsmen to Ephesus from their winter quarters, he secretly assembled them at Magnesia. 11. It so happened that one of Antiochus's soldiers had come to Samos on a private matter. He was arrested as a spy and brought to the commander at Panhormus. Pisistratus asked him what was going on in Ephesus, and he, whether from fear or from lack of loyalty to his own people, is uncertain, told all. The fleet was anchored in the harbor, drawn up ready for action. He said all the oarsmen had been sent to Magnesia. Very few ships had been hauled ashore, and the docks were being covered over. And never had so much effort been spent on naval matters. Pisistratus' mind was distracted by his delusion and false hope, so the man's story was not accepted as true. His preparations complete, Polysenides summoned his oarsmen from Magnesia by night and hurriedly launched the ships which had been beached. He then passed the day there, less because he was preparing than because he did not want his fleet spotted as it moved out. And after sunset he set off with 70 decked ships, and facing a headwind reached the port of Pygella before dawn. He spent the day immobile at Pygella, for the same reason as before, and at night crossed to the closest parts of Samian territory. From here he instructed a certain Nicanor, a pirate chief, spelled Nicnder. Perhaps we could pronounce it Nicander, to head for Palinursus with 5 decked ships, and then take a body of troops by the shortest route across country to Panhormus, to the rear of the enemy. Polysenides himself, meanwhile, divided his fleet so that he could hold the harbor mouth on both sides, and then he made for Panhormus. At first, Pisistratus was briefly stunned by this unexpected move, but then, being an experienced soldier, he quickly pulled himself together, concluding that the enemy could be more easily repulsed on land than on sea. He led his troops in 2 columns to the promontories, which form the harbor, the 2 spits of land sheltering it from the sea. From there he expected that he would easily push back the enemy from both. The sight of Nicander arriving overland upset that strategy, and so, suddenly changing his plan, he ordered them all to board the ships. Sheer pandemonium then broke out among soldiers and sailors alike, and there was a virtual flight to the ships when they saw that they were surrounded on land and on sea at the same time. Pisistratus thought there was only one route to safety, and that was if he could force a way through the harbor mouth and break through to the open sea. When he saw that his men had boarded, he ordered the others to follow him, and himself took the lead, heading for the harbor mouth with his ship being rowed along at maximum speed. As the vessel was just passing the entrance, Polysenides surrounded it with 3 quinquiremes, Struck by their beaks, the ship went down, and the defenders were buried under a hail of missiles. Amongst them, Pisistratus, who lost his life, putting up a spirited fight. Of the other vessels, some were caught before the harbor, and others within. Some were captured by Nicander as they tried to get away from shore. Only 5 Rhodian ships, along with 2 Choan vessels, made their escape good, and did so by opening up a path for themselves between the crowded enemy ships by terrifying them with shooting flames, for they each carried before themselves great quantities of fire, and that they ignited it iron bowls suspended from 2 poles that projected from the prow. Some Erythraean triremes met the fleeing Rhodian ships, which they were coming to reinforce, not far from Samos, after which they changed course to rejoin the Romans in the Hellespont. Close to this time, Seleucus regained Phocaea, which was betrayed to him after one of the gates was opened by the sentries. Kyme and other cities on that coastline also defected to him out of fear. Kyme, spelled Cyme. 12. While this was going on in Aeolus, Abydos had been facing its siege for a number of days, with a garrison of the king defending the walls. By now they were all exhausted, and their magistrates proceeded to discuss terms of surrender with Livius, with the acquiescence even of Philotas, the garrison commander. A solution was delayed because they failed to agree on whether the king's men were to be released with or without weapons. They were negotiating this when news of the Rhodian disaster arrived and took the matter out of their hands, for Livius feared that Polyxenidas might be encouraged by the success of such a major operation to swoop down on the fleet stationed at Cannae. Accordingly, he immediately discontinued the siege of Abydos and his protection of the Hellespont, and launched the ships that had been hauled ashore to Cannae. Eumenes also came to Elea. Livius now made for Phocaea with his entire fleet, to which he had added 2 Mytilenean triremes. On being told the town was occupied by a powerful royal garrison, and that Seleucus's camp was not far away, he raided the coastline hurriedly, loaded the ships with his plunder, which consisted mostly of prisoners, and waited only for Eumenes to catch up with his fleet before setting sail for Samos. Initially, the news of the disaster caused widespread panic and grief amongst the Rhodians, for even apart from the cost in ships and manpower, they had lost the best and strongest of their youth. Many of their nobles had joined Pisistratus, amongst other reasons because of his prestige. Deservedly great amongst his people at that time. Then the thought that they had been taken by trickery, and more than that, by one of their fellow citizens, turned their sorrow to anger. They immediately dispatched 10 ships, and a few days later sent a further 10, putting Eudamus in command of all of them. In general military proficiency, he was not in Pisistratus's league, but they believed he would be a more cautious leader because he was less enterprising. The Romans and Eumenes landed first at Erythrae, and after waiting overnight, here they steered a course for their promontory of Corycus. Sorry, that would be Tian. Well, spelled T-E-A-N. Could be Teen, Tian, or Tyne. No, it wouldn't be Tyne. We'll say, I'm going to go with Tian. The Romans and Eumenes landed first at Erythrae, and after waiting overnight here, they steered a course for the promontory of Tian Coricus the following day, wishing to cross from there to the nearest parts of the island of Samos. They did not wait for sunrise, so the helmsman could observe the state of the weather, but instead set out into uncertain conditions. Halfway through the journey, the northeasterly wind veered due north, and they began to be buffeted by a sea roughened with waves. Thinking that his enemies would head for Samos to join up with the Rhodian fleet, Polyxenidas set sail from Ephesus and at first rode of anchor off Myonisus. From there he crossed to the island called Macris, intending to attack any ships that strayed from the line of the enemy fleet as it passed by, or to fall on the end of the line when given the chance. After he saw that the fleet had been scattered by bad weather, his first thoughts were that he had an opportunity to attack. But a little later the wind increased, producing even higher waves, and he saw that he could not reach the enemy. He therefore crossed to the island of Italia, so that he could from there pounce upon the ships the next day as he headed for Samos from the open sea. As darkness fell, a small number of the Romans made it to a deserted haven in Samian territory, and the rest of the fleet, after spending the whole night storm tossed out at sea, also sought shelter in the same harbor, learning from peasants there that enemy ships were anchored at Italia. They held a meeting to decide whether to fight it out immediately or wait for the Rhodian fleet. The decision was to defer the encounter, and they crossed to Coricus, the point from which they had to come. After a fruitless wait, Polyxenidas also went back to Ephesus. As the sea was now unimpeded by the enemy, the Roman ships crossed to Samos, and the Rhodian fleet arrived at the same destination a few days later. To give the impression that this was all that had been waiting for, the Romans immediately set sail for Ephesus, intending either to decide the contest with a battle at sea, or else to wring an admission of fear from the enemy if he refused battle, something of great importance, vis-a-vis the inclinations of the city-states. The Romans positioned themselves opposite the harbor mouth, with their vessels facing it in a line. When no one came to confront them, they divided the fleet, and one part rode an anchor on the open sea opposite the harbor entrance, while the other put ashore its fighting men. Again, when no one came to confront them, they divided the fleet, and one part rode at anchor on the open sea opposite the harbor entrance, while the other put ashore its fighting men. The latter raided the countryside far and wide, and were bringing back an enormous quantity of booty, when Andronicus the Macedonian, a member of the garrison at Ephesus, made a sortie against them as they were approaching the walls, stripping them of most of their plunder, and driving them back to their vessels on the shore. The next day the Romans set an ambush about halfway between the two sides, and then marched in a column towards the city in order to entice the Macedonians outside their walls. However, suspicion that this very scheme was afoot deterred anyone from coming out, and so they returned to their ships. However, suspicion that this very scheme was afoot deterred anyone from coming out, and so they returned to their ships. The enemy avoiding engagement on both land and sea, the Roman fleet returned to Samos, its point of departure. The praetor then dispatched 2 triremes of the Italian allies and 2 Rhodian triremes, under the command of the Rhodian Epicrates, to keep watch on the strait of Cephallenia. The strait was being rendered perilous by the piracy of the Spartan Hybristus and a group of young Cephallenians, and the sea was already closed to supplies from Italy. 14. Lucius Aemilius Regillus, who was succeeding to the naval command, was met by Piraeus by Epicrates. He was told of the Rhodian defeat, and since he had no more than 2 quinqueremes, he took Epicrates and his 4 ships back to Asia with him. Some open-decked Athenian vessels also accompanied them. Aemilius crossed the Aegean Sea. The Rhodian Timosocrates also reached the same harbor from Samos at dead of night with 2 quadriremes. Taken to Aemilius. Timosocrates said that his mission was to serve as a convoy. Taken to Aemilius, Timosocrates said that his mission was to serve as a convoy because the king's ships, with their repeated forays from the Hellespont and Abydos, were making that coastline hazardous for freighters. Taking to Aemilius, Timosocrates said that his mission was to serve as a convoy because the king's ships, with their repeated forays from the Hellespont and Abydos, were making that coastline hazardous for freighters. Crossing from Chios to Samos, Aemilius was joined by 2 Rhodian quadriremes, which had been sent to meet him by Livius, and by Eumenes with 2 quinqueremes. When they reached Samos, Aemilius assumed command of the fleet from Livius, duly conducted the customary sacrifice, and called a council of war. At the meeting, Gaius Livius was the first to be asked his opinion. Livius said that no one could provide more trustworthy advice than the man who encourages another to do what he himself would have done in that same situation. He had intended sailing to Ephesus with the whole fleet. He explained, taking along with him some transport vessels, heavily loaded with gravel, which he would sink in the harbor mouth. The difficulty of creating an obstruction was lessened by the fact that the harbor mouth was like a river, he said, long, narrow, and with many shallow spots. In this way, he would have deprived the enemy of access to the sea and rendered his fleet useless. 15. Nobody liked the proposal, and Eumenes asked Livius what on earth he was thinking about. Imagine the situation when the vessels had been sunk and the Allies had blocked the harbor mouth, he said. When the fleet then had freedom of action, were they going to leave the harbor to help the Allies and to install terror in the enemy? Or would they continue to blockade the port with the whole fleet just the same? For if they left, no one could doubt that the enemy would raise the submerged wrecks and open the port with less effort than it would take to block it. And if they had to stay there just the same, what was the point of closing the harbor? In fact, he said, the enemy would then have a peaceful campaigning season, enjoying a port that was absolutely secure, and the advantages of a wealthy city, with Asia providing everything they needed. The Romans, meanwhile, would be facing waves and storms on the open sea, short of everything, constantly on guard, and themselves more tied down and restricted with regard to all that they should be doing, apart from maintaining the blockade of the enemy. Eudemus, admiral of the Rhodian fleet, signaled his disapproval of the plan, but without expressing his own opinion on what they should do. Again. Eudamus, admiral of the Rhodian fleet, signalled his disapproval of the plan, but without expressing his own opinion on what they should do. The Rhodian Epicrates voted that they forget Ephesus for the moment and send some of their ships to Lycia to bring Patara, capital of the country, into an alliance. That would prove advantageous in two important ways, he said, with the lands facing either island on friendly terms with them. The Rhodians could bring all their strength to bear on the one war. That against Antiochus, and secondly, the fleet being put together in Cilicia would be prevented from joining up with Polyxenidas. This was the suggestion that prevailed, but it was nevertheless decided that Regillus should sail out to the harbor of Ephesus with all his fleet to intimidate the enemy. 16. Gaius Livius was dispatched to Lycia with 2 Roman quinquiremes, 4 Rhodian quadriremes, and 2 open-decked vessels from Smyrna. His orders were to go to Rhodes first and formulate all his plans in concert with the Rhodians. The city-states that he passed, Miletus, Myndus, Halicarnassus, Cnidus, and COS, yeah, right, COS, with a hyphen there. I don't understand what that means, but I'll just read it as it is. The city-states that he passed, Miletus, Myndus, Halicarnassus, Cnidus, clear enough, but spelt Cnidus, and COS, COS, hyphen. Okay, I guess it's simply called COS, COS, COS. The city-states that he passed, Miletus, Myndus, Halicarnassus, Cnidus, and COS, zealously executed his orders, and when he reached Rhodes, he explained to the Rhodians the purpose of his mission, and at the same time sought out their views on it. The Rhodians were unanimously in favor of the strategy, and Livius sailed on to Patara, with 3 quadriremes added to the fleet he was commanding. At first, a following wind took them towards the city itself, and they had hopes that the sudden panic would yield some result, but the wind changed direction, and the sea began to surge with waves rolling in different directions. They did manage to hold close to the land with the use of their oars, but there was no safe anchorage near the city, and they could not lie off the harbor mouth on the open sea, either because the waters were rough and night was coming on. They sailed past the city walls and headed for the port of Phoenicius, which was less than 2 miles distant from there, and which provided ships with shelter from the fury of the sea. There were, however, lofty cliffs rising above the harbor, and these were quickly seized by the townspeople, who took with them the king's soldiers whom they had in the garrison. Although the shoreline was rough and hard to negotiate, Livius sent against his Assaean auxiliaries and his light infantry from Smyrna. At first it was a matter of skirmishing with missiles and light attacks against limited numbers of the enemy rather than full-scale battle, and during these, Livius's men managed to keep up the fight. Then more people came streaming from the city, and eventually the entire population poured out, making Livius afraid that his auxiliaries might be cut off and his ships be at risk even from the shore. Accordingly, he led out into battle not just his fighting men, but the crews as well, his large contingent of oarsmen, all alarmed with whatever they could lay their hands on. Even then, the battle remained uncertain, and in addition to a number of common soldiers, Lucius Apostius also fell in the disorderly fighting. Eventually, however, the Lycians were completely routed and driven back into their city, and the Romans returned to their ships with a victory won not without loss of blood. From there they set off into the Gulf of Telemissus, which washes Caria on one side and Lycia on the other. Having abandoned all thought, in sharp brackets, of a further attempt on Patara, the Rhodians were sent home, and Livius, after skirting the coast of Asia, crossed to Greece so that he could meet the Scipios, who were in the area of Thessaly at the time, and then sail to Italy. 17. Emilius had himself been driven by Ephesus by a storm, and had returned to Samos with his enterprise aborted. When he learned that the operation in Lycia had been abandoned, and that Livius had left for Italy, he felt the failed attempt on Patara was a disgrace, and decided to go there with his entire fleet and launch a full-scale attack on the city. He sailed past Miletus and the rest of the coastline under Allied control, and landed at Iasus in the Bay of Berghalia. The city was held by a garrison of the king, and the Romans subjected the surrounding countryside to ruthless pillaging. Then a deputation was sent to hold discussions with the leading citizens and magistrates to sound out their inclinations, and when these replied that they were powerless to act, Emilius led out his troops to attack the city. There were with the Romans some exiles from Iasus. These proceeded to appeal to the Rhodians in large numbers not to let an unoffending city perish, which was both their neighbor and ethically connected to them. The reason for their own exile, they declared, was simply their loyalty to the Romans, and those remaining in the city were subject to the same duress from the king's troops that had made them exiles themselves. All the people of Iasus had but one purpose: to escape their servitude to the king. The Rhodians were touched by their entreaties, and they found a supporter in Eumenes. By pointing to their racial ties, and at the same time by expressing pity at the misfortunes of the city at the mercy of a garrison of the king, the Rhodians convinced Emilius not to attack. With control established everywhere else, the allies left Iasus and skirted the coastline of Asia, eventually reaching Lorima, the port facing Rhodes. Here there arose some superstitious talk in the officers' quarters. Again. Here there arose some surreptitious talk in the officers' quarters, beginning among the military tribunes, but then reaching the ears of Emilius himself. It was said that the fleet was being removed from Ephesus and from its own theater of operations, so that the enemy would be left behind them, free to make all manner of attacks with impunity on the many allied cities there. This talk had an effect on Emilius. He called the Rhodians and asked them whether it was possible for the whole fleet to ride to anchor in the harbor at Patara. When the Rhodians declared that impossible, he made this the pretext for abandoning the operation and took the fleet back to Samos. Seleucus, 18. Seleucus, Antiochus' son, had kept his army in Iolus throughout the wintertime, partly engaged in helping his allies, and partly in conducting raids on those whom he could not inveigle into an alliance. Really? Inveigle? Inveigile. That one we'll be looking up. At this time, he decided to move into territory that was part of the kingdom of Eumenes, while the latter was far from home, with the Romans and the Rhodians attacking the coastal areas of Lycia. Seleucus first marched on Elea, but then, foregoing an assault on the city, he exhaustively plundered its agricultural lands and led his army forward to attack Pergamon, the capital and citadel of the realm. Attalus, at first, put guard emplacements before the city and mounted attacks with his cavalry and light infantry, actually harassing his enemy instead of merely mounting a defense. He eventually discovered, from these minor skirmishes, that he was no match for his enemy in any area of his forces, and withdrew within the city walls. The siege of the city thereupon commenced. At about the same time, Antiochus, who had left Ampea, at about the same time, Antiochus, who had left Apamea, established a base first at Sardis, and then at the mouth of the river Celsius. No, wow! One of those days, At about the same time, Antiochus, who had left oh my gosh. Here, okay, we're going to get through this, finish off number 18, and then I'm going to cut it there because obviously my tongue's taking a vacation today. I don't know. About the same time, Antiochus, who had left Apamea, established a base first at Sardis and then at the mouth of the river Caicus, not far from Seleucus's camp. He had with him a powerful army made up of a mixture of different races, but the greatest threat resided in his 4,000 Gallic mercenaries. These soldiers, with a few others added, he sent out to lay waste the fields of Pergamum at many points. When this was reported on Samos, Eumenes, called away by the war in his own land, first of all sailed to Elea with his fleet. When cavalry and light infantry became available, he used them as a protective escort and hurried on to Pergamum before the enemy became aware of his approach or made any move. There, once again, a number of sorties precipitated some light skirmishing, Eumenes clearly avoiding a decisive encounter. A few days later, the Roman and Rhodian fleets reached Elea from Samos to bring assistance to the king. Antiochus was brought the news that the allies had disembarked their troops at Elea, and that many fleets had converged on the one harbor. About the same time, he also heard that the consul was already in Macedonia with his army, and that the preparations required for the crossing of the Hellespont were under way. He now thought the time had come to discuss peace terms before he found himself under pressure on land and sea at the same time. He therefore seized a certain hill facing Elea for his camp, and there left all his infantry After this, he went down with his cavalry, which numbered 6,000, and that's in brackets, into the plains beneath the very walls of Elea, having first sent a herald to Emilius to report that he wished to discuss terms of peace. And I'm going to pause it there and come back to it. My tongue's being retarded right now, so hold on. "19. Emilius summoned Eumenes from Pergamum, and held a meeting to which he invited the Rhodians. The Rhodians were not against peace, but Eumenes declared it was neither honorable to discuss peace terms at this juncture, nor possible to bring the matter to a conclusion. For he said, "How shall we honorably accept so-called terms of peace when we are shut up within our walls facing a siege? Or who will consider such a peace treaty as valid when we shall have struck it without the consul, and without senatorial authorization or the bidding of the Roman people? Suppose peace is made on your authority. I would like to know this: are you going to return to Italy immediately, pulling back your fleet and your army? Or are you going to wait for the consul's pleasure in the matter, for the vote of the Senate, and for the order of the Roman people? Your only option is to stay in Asia, abandon the campaign, and lead back to winter quarters your forces, to drain your allies, who must provide supplies, and then, if those with the authority see fit, we must start the war all over again, though we can have it finished before winter, God willing, if we do not delay and thereby lose some of our drive in the operation." This was the view that carried the day, and the reply given to Antiochus was that peace terms could not be discussed before the arrival of the consul. His attempt to gain peace a failure, Antiochus laid waste the fields of the people of Elea first, then those of Pergamenes. Leaving his son Seleucus there, he next marched on Adramyttium, and headed for the rich land which they call the plain of Thebe, and made famous by Homer's poem, spelled Adramytteum. In no other place in Asia was greater booty won by the soldiers of the king. Emilius and Eumenes, sailing around with their ships, also came to Adramyttium in order to give protection to the city. 20. About this time it happened that 1,000 infantry and 100 cavalry reached Elea from Achaia, all these troops commanded by Diophanes. After disembarking from the ships, they were escorted to Pergamum at night by men who had been sent by Attalus to meet them. They were all veterans with experience of armed combat, and their leader was himself a pupil of Philopoemen. Spelt Philopoemen. Philopoemen? The greatest general amongst all the Greeks of the time. He spent 2 days resting the men and horses, and also in scrutinizing the enemy outposts to see the points at which they came and went, and the times at which they did so. The king's men would advance to a point close to the foot of the hill on which the city stands, thus leaving the land behind them clear for plundering. The townspeople had confined themselves within their walls from fear, and after that there was no sally made from the city, not even to throw spears at the outposts at long range. Now contempt for them arose amongst the king's men, followed by inattention to their duties. Most of them did not have their horses saddled or bridled. A few remained under arms and in their ranks, but the rest had slipped away and dispersed throughout the plain, a number engaging in young men's sports and fun, some eating in the shade, and others even lying asleep on the ground. This Diophanes saw from the heights of the city of Pergamum, and he ordered his men to take up arms and hold themselves in readiness at the gate. He himself went to Attalus and explained that he intended to assault an enemy outpost. Attalus allowed this with reluctance, since he could see that Diophanes would be facing 600 cavalry with 100 and 4,000 infantry with 1,000, and Diophanes passing through the gate,
installed himself not far from the enemy outpost, waiting for his opportunity. The people in Pergamon believed this was insanity rather than daring. The enemy, too, turned their attention to them for only a short while, and when they saw no activity, they made no alteration to their usual laxness, going so far as to mock the small numbers of their enemy as well. For some time, Diophanes kept his men at a standstill, as if they had been brought out simply to watch. When he saw the enemy had broken ranks, he instructed the infantry to follow with all the speed they could muster. Putting himself at the head of the cavalry with his own troop, he made a sudden charge on the enemy outpost, galloping as rapidly as possible, and with the war cry raised simultaneously by every foot soldier and horseman. Even the horses were terrified, and not just the men. They burst their reins and created panic and havoc amongst their own men. A few horses stood unperturbed, but the men could not easily saddle or bridle or mount these, either because the Achaeans struck far greater terror in them than the number of their cavalrymen warranted. The infantry in ranks and well prepared attacked a foe carelessly, disordered, and virtually half asleep. Men were slaughtered and put to flight all through the field. Diophanes chased the scattered enemy as far as it was safe, and then returned to service in the garrison of the city. He had won a great glory for the Achaean nation, for the combat had been witnessed from the walls of Pergamon by men and women alike. '21. The next day the king's advance guards encamped a half-mile further from the city in better order and closer formation, and the Achaeans went forward at roughly the same time and to the same place as on the previous occasion. For several hours both sides waited intently for the attack which they expected at any moment. When it was time to return to camp, not long before sunset, the king's men brought their standards together and proceeded to march off in a column organized more for marching than for fighting. Diophanes did nothing as long as they were in sight. Then he bore down on the rear of the column with the same ferocity as the day before, and once more struck panic into them and caused such chaos that although their rear was being cut down, no one halted to put up a fight. Terror-stricken and barely managing to keep their marching column together, they were driven back to their camp. This intrepid feat of the Achaeans obliged Seleucus to withdraw his camp from Pergamene territory. When Antiochus was told that the Romans had arrived to offer protection to Adramyttium, he at least kept clear of that city, and after laying waste the countryside, he went on to storm Perea, a colony of the Mytilenaeans. Cotton, Coriolanus, Aphrodisias, and Phryne were taken with the first assault. From there, Antiochus returned to Sardes by way of Thyatira, and Seleucus remained on the coast, intimidating some, the assisting others. From there, Antiochus returned to Sardes by way of Thyatira, and Seleucus remained on the coast, intimidating some and assisting others. The Roman fleet, along with Eumenes and the Rhodians, came to Mytilene, first of all, after that returning to Elea, their starting point. From there, on their journey to Phocaea, they put in at the island called Bacchium, which overlooks the city of Phocaea, and after brutally plundering its temples and statues, which they had previously spared and with which the island was very well endowed, they crossed to the city itself. They proceeded with the attack after They proceeded with the attack after distributing amongst themselves the various responsibilities involved, and it looked as if the town could be taken by assault with scaling ladders without the use of siege works. However, a garrison comprising 3,000 soldiers entered the city sent by Antiochus, and the allies immediately abandoned the attack and retreated to the island with nothing achieved save the plundering of enemy territory around the city. 22. It was decided that Eumenes should be sent home from here, and that he should undertake for the consul and the army the necessary preparations for crossing the Hellespont. The Roman and Rhodian fleets were to return to Samos, and there kept watch in case Polyxenidas moved from Ephesus. The king then returned to Elea, the Romans and Rhodians to Samos. Here Marcus Aemilius, brother of the praetor, died. There was a report of a fleet coming from Syria, and after Aemilius's funeral, the Rhodians sent off to meet it with 13 of their own ships, one going Quinquirim, and the second from Cnidus, sailing to Rhodes, where they were to remain on guard. 13 ships had also been sent from Rhodes under the command of Pamphilidus against the same Syrian fleet. And 2 days before Eudemus came from Samos with his fleet, these linked up with the 4 ships that had been guarding Caria, or Caria, and raised the siege of Daedala and a number of other fortresses in Perea, which were being blockaded by the king's troops. The decision was made that Eudemus should leave at once, and he was assigned 6 open-deck vessels to add to the fleet which he commanded. After setting sail, he made all the speed he could and overtook the men who had gone ahead at the port called Megeste. From there, they came to Phaselis in a single column, and the best idea seemed to be to await the enemy in that spot. 23. Phaselis lies on the border of Lycia and Pamphylia, projecting far out to sea. It is the first land to be sighted by voyagers coming from Cilicia to Rhodes, and it also affords a view of shipping in the distance. For that reason, more than any other, it was chosen as the place to meet the enemy fleet. But there was an unforeseen occurrence because of the insalubrious locality, the time of the year. It was midsummer, in brackets, and also because of an unusual stench. Diseases began to attack a large number of them, especially the oarsmen. Fearing this outbreak, they left the place, and as they were sailing along the Gulf of Pamphylia, they put in at the river Eurymedon, where they were told by the people of Aspendus that the enemy were already at side. The king's navy had made quite a slow voyage because of the Etesians, which make this an unfavorable time of the year, one almost exclusively given over to northwesterly winds. The Rhodians had 32 quadriremes and 4 triremes, and the king's fleet comprised 37 ships of larger dimensions, including 3 galleys, with 7 banks of oars, and 4 with 6 banks, and 10 triremes in addition to these. From a lookout tower they perceived that the enemy was at hand. The following day both fleets moved from port at dawn, assuming they would fight that day, and before the Rhodians passed the headland projecting into the sea from side, they were suddenly spotted by the enemy, whom they also sighted themselves. In the king's fleet, the left wing, which was on the side of the open sea, was commanded by Hannibal, the right by Apollonius, one of the king's courtiers, and they now had their vessels drawn up in line. The Rhodians came forward in a long line, the flagship of Eudemus first, Chariclitorus bringing up the rear, and Pamphilidus commanding the center part of the fleet.
Well, folks, there are boo-boos and then there are blunders. The name, Chariclitus, is spelled Chariclitus. Chariclitus. Right? The Rhodians came forward in a long line, the flagship of Eudemus first, Chariclitus bringing up the rear, and Pamphilidus commanding the center part of the fleet. When Eudemus saw the enemy line drawn up and ready to join battle, he too moved out into open water, ordering the ships that were following up to form a straight line while maintaining their order. Initially, this move caused confusion. Eudemus had not sailed far enough out to permit all his ships to be deployed in a line towards the land, and being over hasty, he engaged Hannibal with a mere 5 vessels. The others, because they had been ordered to make a line, were not following him. At the end of the column, there was no room left on the landward side. The confusion reigned amongst them while the battle with Hannibal was starting on the right wing. 24. But in a trice, the quality of their vessels and their accomplished seamanship removed all fear from the Rhodians. The ships sailed swiftly into open water, each leaving behind it space on the landward side for one moving up, and if any of them collided with any enemy vessel with its beak, it would tear open its prow or shear off its oars, or else, finding any open passage between the lines, it would sail past the enemy ship and attack its stern. The greatest dismay was occasioned by the sinking, after a single impact, of a king's ship with 7 banks of oars by a much smaller Rhodian craft. As a result, the right flank of the enemy was quite clearly preparing for flight. On the open waters, Eudemus, who had by far the advantage in all other respects, was under severe pressure from Hannibal because of his ship's superior numbers. He would have been surrounded by Hannibal had not the usual signal for bringing together a scattered fleet been raised on the flagship. At this, all the ships had been victorious on the right wing, hurriedly got together to assist their comrades. Then Hannibal, and the ships with him, also took to flight, and the Rhodians were unable to give chase because most of the oarsmen were in poor health, and so more quickly fatigued. They were rebuilding their strength with food where they had stopped on the open sea. Eudemus watched the enemy hauling their disabled and damaged vessels with tow ropes from open-deck ships, and saw not many more than 20 moving off unharmed. He called for silence from the tower of the flagship. "Get up and take in a wonderful sight," he said. They all rose and looked at their enemy in terror-stricken flight, and with almost one voice they shouted out that they should give chase. Eudemus' own ship had been damaged by numerous collisions, but he ordered Pamphilidus and Chariclitus to follow for as long as they thought they could in safety. They did follow for a while, but after Hannibal began to approach the shore, they became afraid of being pinned down by the wind on a coast held by the enemy, and they returned to Eudemus. Then with difficulty they towed to Phaselis the captured ship with 7 banks of oars, which had been wrecked with the first collision. They returned from there to Rhodes, elation over their victory, taking second place to mutual recrimination. They returned from there to Rhodes, elation over their victory, taking second place to mutual recrimination over their failure to sink or capture the entire fleet of their enemy when it had been possible to do so. Hannibal had suffered only one defeat, but even so,
he did not venture to sail beyond Lycia, despite his eagerness to join up with King's original fleet at the earliest opportunity. Moreover, the Rhodians sent Charicletus with 20 beaked ships to Patara and the harbor of Majesty to see that he would not have the latitude to do that. They also ordered Eudemus to return to the Romans on Samos, with 7 of the largest ships from amongst the fleet that had been under his command, so that he could use all his diplomacy and personal authority to push the Romans into storming Patara. 25. News of the victory, first of all, and after that, the arrival of the Rhodians, brought great joy to the Romans, and it was evident that if the Rhodians had been relieved of a particular concern which they had voiced, they would have had the freedom of action to provide security for all the waterways in the region. But Antiochus's departure from Sardes prevented them from abandoning their protective role in Ionia and Aeolus, so that the coastal cities might not fall to him. The Rhodians sent Pamphilidus with 4 decked ships to join the fleet off Patara. Antiochus was in the process of bringing together the garrisons from the city-states around him, but he had also sent emissaries to King Prusias of Bithynia with a letter of complaint about the Romans' passage into Asia. They were coming, said Antiochus, to wipe out all the monarchies, so that there would be no empire left anywhere in the world but that of Rome. Philip and Nabis had been conquered, and he was the third to be under attack. As each lay next to a defeated neighbor, the fire next door, as it were, would sweep through them all. After him, the Romans' next step would be into Bithynia, since Eumenes had already acquiesced in voluntary servitude. Antiochus's words troubled Prusias, who was only diverted from such suspicions by a letter from the consul, Scipio, and more so by one of Scipio's brother, Africanus. The latter drove Prusias to make himself worthy of his friendship by referring to the enduring practice of the Roman people of bestowing all manner of honors on allied royalty to promote their standing, and also by adducing examples of Africanus's own record in this. He pointed to petty chieftains in Spain whom he had made his protégés and left as kings, and to Massinissa, whom he had not only set on his father's throne, but also put on that of Syphax, spelt Syphax, by whom he had been earlier deposed, and as well as being by far the richest of the kings of Africa, Massinissa could match any king in the entire world in regal majesty and power. Philip and Nabis had been enemies conquered in war by Titus Quinctius, he continued, but even so they had been left on the throne. Indeed, Philip had even seen payment of his tribute remitted the previous year, and his hostage son returned to him. He had also recovered a number of city-states outside Macedonia, with the acquiescence of the Roman commanders. Nabis, too, would have been held in the same regard if his own madness in the first place, and then the treachery of the Aetolians, had not destroyed him. The king's mind was really made up when the ambassador who came to him from Rome was Gaius Livius, who had earlier commanded the fleet as praetor, and when Livius explained to him how much more certain were the Romans' hopes of victory than Antiochus's, and how much more inviolate and reliable a friendship with Romans would be. (26) After losing all hope of an alliance with Prusias, Antiochus left Sardes for Ephesus to inspect the fleet, which had for a number of months been fitted out and made ready for action. He did this more because he could see it was impossible to resist the Roman army and the two Scipios with his land forces, than because he had ever had any success in naval warfare himself, or because he felt any great or certain confidence in it at that time. For the moment, however, he had some reason to be hopeful because he had heard that most of the Rhodian fleet was off Patara, and also that Eumenes had left for the Hellespont with all his ships to rendezvous with the consul, and his spirits were further raised by the piece of treacherous opportunism that had put paid to the Rhodian fleet at Samos. His confidence raised by these considerations, Antiochus sent Polyxenides with the fleet to put fortune to the test in any manner of engagement, and he himself led the troops to Notium. This is a town belonging to Colophon, overlooking the sea and about 2 miles distant from Old Colophon. He wanted to have the town itself under his control. It lay so close to Ephesus that no activity on land or sea could escape the eyes of Colophonians, by whom it would be immediately made known to the Romans. He was convinced that when they heard about the siege, the Romans would move their fleet among Samos to bring succor to an allied city, and that would be Polyxenides' opportunity to come to grips with them. He therefore proceeded to invest the city with siege works. He ran parallel walls down to the sea on both sides, and on either side he brought siege sheds and a mount up to the wall and moved up the battering ram with its protective cover. Cowed by the dangers facing them, the Colophonians sent spokesmen to Lucius Aemilius on Samos, begging for the protection of a praetor and the Roman people. Aemilius was galled by his long period of inactivity at Samos, for the last thing he expected was that Polyxenides, whom he had twice challenged in vain, would give him the opportunity to engage. Moreover, he thought it a disgrace that the fleet of Eumenes should be helping the consul transport the legions to Asia, while he himself was tied up bringing relief to the beleaguered city of Colophon, with no idea of when the operation would end. The Rhodian Eudemus, who had also kept him at Samos earlier, when he wanted to leave for the Hellespont, was now joined by all the others in pressing him to stay, but much better to raise the blockade of the allies, they said, or else inflict another defeat on the navy they had already beaten twice, and thereby wrest from the enemy total control of the sea. Much better than to abandon his allies, surrender mastery of Asia on land and sea to Antiochus, and leave his own sector of the war by going to the Hellespont, where the fleet of Eumenes provided sufficient service. 27. Their provisions exhausted, the Romans set off from Samos to gather supplies and were preparing to cross at Chios. This served as a granary for the Romans and was a place to which all transport vessels sent from Italy directed their course. They sailed from the city to the other side of the island, which faces north towards Chios and Erythrae, and were preparing to make the crossing when the praetor was informed in a letter that a large quantity of grain had reached Chios from Italy, but that the ships carrying wine had been held up by bad weather. Along with this same news, that the people of Chios had supplied the king's fleet with generous quantities of provisions and had promised 5,000 jars of wine. In mid-journey, Aemilius suddenly turned the fleet towards Chios, intending to take over the supplies prepared for the enemy with the agreement of the people of Chios, or else to treat these latter as enemies. After turning their prows toward the shore, some 15 ships appeared before them off Myonisus, and the praetor, initially believing them to be from the king's fleet, proceeded to give chase, but it then became clear that they were cutters and skiffs of buccaneers. These had been raiding the coastline of Chios, and were returning with all manner of booty. And when they saw the Roman fleet from the open sea, they turned to flight. They had the advantage of speed with their lighter vessels, which had been designed only for that purpose, and they were also closer to land. As a result, they made good their escape to Myonisus before the Roman fleet could get near them. The praetor, who had no knowledge of the area, began to follow them, thinking he could force the ships out of the harbor. Myonisus is a promontory lying between Teos and Samos, and is actually a cone-shaped hill rising from a rather broad base to a sharp peak. On the landward side, it is accessible by a narrow pathway, and on the seaward side, it terminates with cliffs eroded by the waves, so that in places the overhanging rocks jut out to sea beyond the vessels that are at anchor there. The Roman ships give not venture to approach land in that area for fear of coming within weapon range of the pirates, who were standing on the cliffs above them, and so they fritted away a day. Finally, with the approach of night, they abandoned their abortive enterprise and moved on to Teos the following day. They moored their ships in the harbor behind the town. Its local name is Gerasticus, and the praetor sent his men forth to pillage the countryside around the city. 28. As the pillaging went on before their eyes, the people of Teos sent spokesmen to the Roman commander with the fillets and branches of suppliants. These attempted to exonerate their community of any hostility towards the Romans in either word or deed, but Aemilius charged them with having given assistance to the enemy fleet with all manner of provisions, and drew attention to the amount of wine they had promised Polyxenidas. He added that if they provided the Roman fleet with the same quantity of supplies, he would recall his men from their marauding, but that he would otherwise treat them as foes. When the envoys reported this sinister response, the people were summoned to a meeting by the magistrates to discuss the action they should take. Polyxenidas had left Colophon with the king's fleet on hearing that the Romans had moved from Samos, and were pillaging the fields of the Teians, after their pursuit of the pirates to Myconisus. Polyxenidas had left Colophon with the king's fleet on hearing that the Romans had moved from Samos, and were pillaging the fields of the Teians, after their pursuit of the pirates to Myonisus, and that their ships were at anchor in the harbor of Gerasticus. On that day, he happened to drop anchor in a sequestered harbor on an island opposite Myonisus, which sailors call Macris. From there, Polyxenidas examined that his enemy was doing at close quarters, and at first he had high hopes of defeating the Roman fleet by the same means as he had the Rhodian at Samos, when he had blockaded the narrow exit from the harbor. The natural features of the place are not dissimilar. The harbor is so restricted by two promontories coming together that it is barely possible for two ships to make their exit at the same time. Polyxenidas' intention was to seize the harbor mouth at night, and with 10 ships stationed off each of the two promontories, to attack the enemy vessel side on, from both flanks as they came out. He would put ashore soldiers from the rest of the fleet, as he had at Panormus, and make a simultaneous assault on the enemy by land and sea. His plan would not have gone awry had not the Romans decided, when the Teians promised to meet their demands, that it was better for the fleet to move to the harbor in front of the city in order to take the supplies on board. It is also said that the Rhodian Eudemus pointed out the shortcomings of the other port when two ships happened to break off their oars after becoming entangled in the restricted harbor entrance. And the danger on the landward side, with Antiochus encamped not far away, was also one of the number of factors that induced the praetor to transfer the fleet. 29. The fleet was brought round to the city in complete secrecy, and the soldiers and crews disembarked to distribute the supplies, the wine in particular, amongst the ships. Then, about midday, it so happened that a peasant was brought to the praetor, and he reported that a fleet had been riding at anchor off the island of Macree for 2 days now, and that a short while ago a number of the ships appeared to be moving, as if getting ready to sail. The praetor was stunned by this unexpected news. He ordered the bugles he ordered the bugles sounded for the return of all those dispersed in the fields, and he sent tribunes to the city to bring together the soldiers and sailors to the ships. The ensuing panic resembled that scene when a fire suddenly breaks out or a city has been captured. Some were running to the city to fetch their comrades. Others were swiftly heading back to the ships from town. And with others, with orders confounded by the confused shouts, which themselves were being drowned out by the bugles, they finally converged on the ships. Each man could scarcely recognize his own ship or reach it in the melee, and the panic could have produced a dangerous situation both on land and on sea, had it not been for the division of task made by Emilius and by Eudemus and the Rhodian fleet. The former was the first to sail out from the port into open water with his flagship, drawing out the other ships which followed in his wake, and then setting each ship in its place to form a line, and Eudemus and the Rhodians meanwhile stuck close to shore so that the men could board without commotion, and each ship could make its exit as soon as it was ready. So it was that the foremost vessels formed up in line before the praetor's eyes, while the rear was brought up by the Rhodians, and the whole line advanced into open water, drawn up in order, as if they had the king's men in view. They were between Myonisus and the promontory of Corycus when they caught sight of the enemy. The king's fleet, which was approaching in a long line, 2 ships abreast, almost formed up facing their enemy, and extended the left wing far enough to enable it to overlap and surround the Roman right. Eudemus, who was bringing up the allied rear, saw that the Romans were unable to make their line equal to the king's, and that they were on the verge of being surrounded on the right wing. Making his ships put on speed, and the Rhodian vessels were by far the swiftest in the entire fleet, he made the flank equal to the enemy's, and then set his own ship in the path of the enemy flagship, which had Polyxenidas on board. 30. By now, battle had been joined in every quarter by the entire fleets. On the Roman side, 80 ships were taking part in the engagement, 22 of them Rhodian. The enemy fleet comprised 89 vessels, and its largest ships were 3 with 6 banks of oars and 2 with 7. The Romans were far superior to the Rhodians in the robustness of their vessels and the courage of their men, while the Rhodian ships had the advantage in mobility, the helmsman's skill, and the proficiency of the oarsmen. However, the ships carrying fire before them inspired the greatest terror in the enemy, and what had proved their unique source of salvation when they were surrounded by Panormus was what on this occasion contributed most to their victory. Fear of the flames before them made the king's ships turn aside to avoid collision. The result was that they were then unable to strike the enemy with their beaks, and at the same time they exposed themselves to broadside ramming, and at and any ship that did engage was consumed by the fire that poured onto it. So they were more in dread of the flames than they were of combat. But, as usual, what counted most in the fighting was the courage of the men. After breaking the center of the enemy line, the Romans sailed around and made an attack from the rear on the king's ship that were engaging the Rhodians. In a moment, the center of Antiochus's line and the ships on the left flank were being surrounded and sunk. The right wing remained intact, and the sailors were more frightened by the disaster that had overtaken their comrades than by the peril they faced themselves. And when they saw the others surrounded and Polyxenidas' flagship abandoning their comrades and sailing off, they hurriedly raised their topsails and fled. And there was a following wind for the journey to Ephesus. They had lost 42 ships in the engagement. 13 had fallen into the hands of their enemy, and the others had been burned or sunk. On the Roman side, 2 ships were wrecked and a number disabled, and 1 Rhodian vessel was captured through an extraordinary mishap. After ramming a Sidonian ship with its beak, its anchor was flung out of the ship by the actual force of the collision, and this held to the prow of the ship with its fluke, just like a grappling iron. Panic ensued, and the Rhodians backed water as they tried to break free of the enemy. The cable was dragged along, becoming entangled in the oars, and shearing them off on one side of the ship. The vessel thus disabled was then captured by the very one with which it had become entangled after ramming it. Such, by and large, was the action in the sea battle of Myonnesus. And I think we're going to stop right there at part 30 of chapter or book 37. That brings us to the halfway mark of that particular chapter. We'll pick up with verse 31 in the next. Thank you.